So, just to give a little background on the two presenters today, we've got Maboula Soumahoro, who is a French scholar, Afrofeminist, and associate professor in the English department at the University of Tours in France. She has contributed to the French Committee on the History of Slavery and launched the French version of Black History Month in 2012. She has published several texts, most notably Black is the Journey, Africana the Name, which was distinguished by the Fetkan Marie Scondé Literary Prize in 2020. Alongside Maboula, we have Anne-Gaëlle Saliot, who is an associate professor of Romance Studies with a secondary appointment in art history, and visual studies at Duke University, and serves as the current director of the Center for French and Francophone Studies. She is the author of The Drowned Muse, Against the Grain, Jean-Luc Godard, Jacques Rivette, François Truffaut, and the 19th Century, and she is the co-editor of the Cahiers de la NRF, dedicated to Philippe Fauré.
Thank you very much for this introduction. And I would like to start by saying that I wish I could rap, I wish I could slam, I wish I could dance, I wish I could play the cello. It's a bit difficult to be on stage for more of not an academic, but a dialogue after we had such wonderful music. And we are going to explore a parallel, something that is a bit specific, I think, to the Franco-American dialogue, which is the impact of the March on Washington to the situation of French migrants in France in the 1980s. You might have heard of la Marche pour l'égalité et contre le racisme, which was organized in 1983, so the March for Equality, and Against Racism, which was then nicknamed by the journalist La Marche des Beurs, Beurs being a slang word for North African people in France. This march was inspired by the dreams of Martin Luther King. It's a testimony to the vitality, to the circulation of dreams, to the capacity to create, to evolve, to change, to dialogue. This march was, in fact, the result of extreme political violence by the French state. It happened at a time when there were a lot of murders of North Africans in France, most especially, the youngest victim being aged less than 10 years old. And it is within this context that there were riots as well in the city of Lyon in France, or more rather in the Vénissieux banlieue. And another act of violence, a very embodied and corporal one, was one which was on the head, a young head of a youth movement of the banlieue, Tumi Jaija, who was shot and very seriously harmed by the French police. The reaction to that was a pacifist march, a march that was a rapture of intelligibility for migrants in France. It was the first time that migrants and children of migrants were being visible, were taking the speech, were being vocal about their situation. And never before we had seen a march like this, which was a march which lasted from October 15 to December 3, from Marseille to Paris, from the south to the north of France, but not only through big cities, but also through rural spaces. It started with a dozen of activists. It ended up at 100,000 people in Paris, and by the delegates being then welcomed at the Élysée by the then President de la République, François Mitterrand. This was consequential at that time, or at least it felt like this, but we can interrogate today the legacies of this. And the first question I would like to ask Maboula, and I would like also to say that that's kind of testimony to the previous guest, that this march arrived at a time that France was also discovering rap, American rap and hip-hop was discovering new sounds, new music, new ways of moving. And I think that, imagine that there's also a sonor, a kind of sound environment to what we are going to talk about. But the question I would like to ask Maboula is that how can we, draw parallel between a march that ended up 100,000 of people to the millions of protesters in the US? And how can we make, and in which ways maybe the experience of North African in France could be commensurate with that of African American in the US?
Thank you for this question, Anne-Gaëlle. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Okay, I thought I was in Atlanta. Good evening, Atlanta. Okay. So I'm so happy to be part of the Night of Ideas. I want to thank the Villa Albertine for inviting me this year, and of course we're here in this museum. So to jump right in the conversation, I think that as Anne-Gaëlle said, we are not going to rhyme, right? We're not going to rhyme. We don't do that.
I wish I could.
But there can still be a parallel with everything that happened beforehand, because the title of our presentation is It Was All a Dream. And if I say it was all a dream, I'm sure many of you remember the song that I'm taking these lyrics from. So it was all a dream. I used to salt and pepper. Okay, we're here. So the reason why I drew from the Notorious BIG, that is to say the northern part of the United States, Brooklyn, New York, is because we were invited to reflect on this notion of dreams in the context of today's reality and the contemporary times. And I know that a lot of activists, a lot of doers have gathered today to talk about what is urgent, what the emergencies are. But I think that it's also important to remember all these moments in history where dreams were the foundation, and that allowing, for people allowing themselves to dream did yield some progress in some form. So, of course, being in Atlanta, thinking of Martin Luther King and all the civil rights movement, thinking about the 1963 March on Washington, and thinking about, so that is to say, let's say the south of the United States, and then moving up to New York, Brooklyn, and the Notorious B.I.G. hip-hop culture as defiant culture originally, and then crossing the Atlantic from, to go to France, hexagonal France, where I was born and where I grew up, to go back to this March of 1983 that Anne-Gaëlle just mentioned. The objective of this presentation is to pay attention to the echoes and to the movements that are in conversation from all sides of the Atlantic. We've been using the term the Black Atlantic for a long time now. But the idea was to perhaps remind France and the rest of the world, the United States tonight, Atlanta tonight, that in 1983, 100,000 people gathered in Paris after marching for weeks from the south of France, departing from the city of Marseille to arrive in the city of Paris in December of 1983 to, let's say for the first time at this grand scale, present to hexagonal France these issues that pertain to post-colonial immigration and that pertain to the transformation due to demography and migration waves that transformed the meaning and perhaps the bodies of the French citizenship. And the reason why this march was held in 1983, beyond the lasting issues of police brutality in the French context, it was also a tribute that was paid to the 20th anniversary of the 1963 March on Washington that was organized in the context of the civil rights movement. So that may appear as an unexpected twist, right? But I think that any occurrence or any movement that takes place and that is rooted, deeply anchored in one place, might be the source of inspiration in places that are not, directly connected to that particular, motion or that particular spark. So this is what I can say about the first question.
Okay, so maybe going back to the question of the context, because of course those two marches were reflective of the specific social, political context of the time, but both of them were nevertheless expression and symptom of Western powers who have practiced slave ownership and colonial history and colonialism. And what I find quite striking about the 1983 march is that it did something that is sometimes a bit forgotten in the memory of it. It was also the first time that a public commemoration of one of the most terrible massacre of the Algerian War was held. So it was the first time that people commemorate the 17th October 1961, which was the biggest massacre of working class civilians in the French Hexagone since the Commune. A massacre which was organized by Papon, who himself was Maurice Papon, who was responsible for the deportations of the Jews of the Veldiv. And that was the first moment we had this kind of public act of memory for this very repressed episode of French history. So what I want us maybe to explore a bit more is that post-colonial history was everywhere, but it was not in the kind of mediatic coverage of it that explicit. It was for the organizers very explicit, but not very much. You know, when you think of the derogatory term, la marche des beurs, it's the kind of, when you think about those commemoration of October 17, it kind of missed the point of what was in fact going on in terms of citizenship and memory of colonization.
I think that this is a very important point, because I'm sure that if we were to take a poll among the French population, people would be very familiar with Martin Luther King and the 1963 march, right? But if we were to ask people names of the leaders of the 1983 march that we are referring to, I think that the answers would be, less significant. The number of answers would be less significant. People such as Tumi Jaija or Jida Tazdaït and so many others. I think it has to do with the difference, I think perhaps the conceptual difference between the United States of America and France. I think that in the United States of America, if we get into African American history, there have been, without attempting to erase any tensions, there has been a continuous presence of people of African origin within the national borders of the United States of America, even before the very founding of the United States of America. That is to say, since 1619. Since 1619, there has been a significant, black population on what was to become the United States of America. That is to say that whatever legal system was put into place, whatever form of institution that were forged, just like the institution of slavery, everything had to be shaped by the law on the territory, and these were affecting people that were on the territory. That is to say that the psyche of the United States of America, even though it was excluding, dominating, and marginalizing those black populations and the descendants of slaves, they had to deal with the presence of those bodies. The context of France is a little different because there is a dichotomy, a geographic dichotomy, between what we call hexagonal France, that is to say the European part of France, and what is called the overseas territories. The overseas territories that were part of the French Empire are all, for the most part, located outside of the European part of France. I'm talking about the Caribbean, Martinique, Guadeloupe, Saint Martin, Latin America with French Guiana. I'm talking about the Indian Ocean with Reunion Island and Mayotte. Talking about the Pacific Ocean and French Polynesia. I'm talking about Saint-Pierre and Miquelon up in Canada. All of those places were part of the French Empire. And they were also shaped legally from hexagonal France. And, slavery happened, the transatlantic and Pacific trades happened, colonialism happened, but it was far away. And I think that this distance has allowed the national psyche of the French to keep this history at a distance.
Yes, exactly.
So when in 1983, people who are, for the most part, descendants of immigrants, part of the post-colonial immigrant wave of immigration, or sometimes they were born on French territory. They speak to the Republic, and say, we, presenting themselves, we are the new French. And as the new French, not as outsiders, not as colonial subjects, not as immigrants, we are the new French, and we have something to say about the meaning of this citizenship from within, and no longer from without, right? So that to me, that's the main differences, the African-American history and, let's say, post-colonial history in France that will not be limited to black people. It's going to be black people, but from the African continent. It's going to be black people from the Caribbean continent. It's going to be Asian people. It's going to be people who are not immigrants. I'm talking about people from the overseas territories who did not gain independence and who are still, that are still part of the Republic, right? So it's a little more complicated. It's going to be a lot of, black and brown or non-white population. There's also going to be the issue of, Islam today that also works as a type of, tool of racialization. So it's not a perfect parallel that can be drawn, but it's still a story of domination, exclusion, marginalization, with the local cuisine.
Yeah. I'm just being quite cautious of the time because I got a sign, and there are questions I really would like to ask you. One is about, the translation of dream. What happens when a dream migrate? When a dream change territory? What about the deterritorialization of dreams? Maybe you can try to answer that one, and then I will move on to the next one. But
that's a deep question. What happens to dreams? When they circulate, when they go across borders, when they defy and do not respect borders, because those borders do not make any sense. They do not make any historical sense. If we're talking about diasporas, right? Populations that have been scattered, those populations cannot respect and abide by the, the national borders. Like the diaspora model is the anti-nation state model. So what happens to dreams when they travel and when they circulate? Perhaps they become bigger. Perhaps they enrich one another. They enter conversations between one another, and they do get simultaneously translated and anchored. That is to say, it's not about, a Tumi Jaija dreaming about Martin Luther King 20 years before and importing, some US ideals on French soil. It's Tumi Jaija and so many others, meaning individuals, but also organizations, understanding the I Have a Dream speech of 1963 and trying to adapt it to their context. Own needs and their own context in France. And to me, that's the beauty of it. That's an enlargement. That's an enrichment. So dreams can travel, and thank God dreams can travel, right?
So now the question is about, so there have been, as you know, the legacy of the 1983 march is one that is a bit sweet and sour. There was no positive action following that march. There was no real legislative changes. And even racism motive as an aggravation of crimes was only considered voted by the French government in 2003. So it's not as if it had, even though it was a crucial moment in the history of civic rights, as you have very well explained in relation to citizenship and understanding of citizenship, the legislative impact was not the same that the march on Washington. And so maybe in order to finish and to conclude, what we can try to think about is about the persistence of dream, their precariousness as well, but their resilience, and what remains today of that march. And I'm thinking that the only time we saw those kind of march was in 2020 with the Comité Vérité et Justice pour Adama Traoré following the murder of George Floyd. So, what happened between 1983 and 2020? What are the legacies today? And
I think that things have happened between 1983 and 2020. First, if there was, of course, the George Floyd phenomenon, global phenomenon, and that a particular, organization fighting, for justice in yet another case of police brutality, right? The Committee for Justice for Adama Traoré. Even though this committee drew attention in 2020 in the larger context of, the murder of George Floyd, the committee had been established since 2016, right? So in 2020, the committee had been marching for already 4 years, but it gained attention only in 2020. So, and so this is one example of things that have happened between 1983 and 2020. I think that 2005, what has been called the urban riots, also were, a landmark in, those questions, public debates and public policies that deal with, this issue of post-colonial migration, these new citizens. So I think that it's not so much, or it's not solely what has happened or not happened. It's about the knowledge and the memory of what has happened. If we use the example of 1963 and the civil rights movement in the United States of America, all historians know that, what has been conceived as the long civil rights movement is not to be limited in the 1950s and 60s. So if we're talking about the civil rights legislation of the 50s and the 60s, we're talking about the time of victory. But the time of victories cannot erase, the century-old resistance and protest that has, shaped the African-American experience. So things that happened in 1619, 1719, 1819, 1919, up to the victories, the legal victories of the 50s and 60s. So I think that the same thing should be taken into account in the French context. Maybe there's not enough attention paid to the legacy, but the work is to bring greater light to that particular legacy and the things that it happened. So 1983, 2005, 2020 or 16, whatever. We have the history, we just need to make it more visible. When Martin Luther King in 1963 delivers the I Have a Dream speech, he has delivered that sermon before, right? He has toured, African-American churches with I Have a Dream before. The let's say, level that this speech gets in 1963 is only because it's delivered in Washington, D.C., and there's the media, and then it becomes mainstream. But the speech itself preceded that, hot day of August of 1963.
Yeah.
So it's just, a tiring, exhausting, but necessary, continuation of the struggle.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Yeah, perfect. I think we are done.